Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. We know that our tribal communities need to be part of the Build Back Better plan, the American Jobs Plan. For far too long, we've seen both tribal nations and territories be put in second class citizenship when it comes to a lot of the investments in our country. We're not doing that anymore. I know in Florida we have both the Seminole tribe, which has rural and suburban and urban parts of their tribal lands. We have the Miccosukee, predominantly rural, and also Porch Creek, predominantly rural in the northern part of the state. And we see challenges limiting growth and economic prosperity in many tribal nations because of a lack of infrastructure, particularly a lack of access to internet. So I want to ask a question or set of questions to Mr. Walter W. Haas of the general manager of the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. Mr. Haas, your testimony mentions how cell phone service in many areas of the Navajo Nation is limited because major carriers own the majority of spectrum, but are not adequately deploying equipment to allow a mobile phone user to make a call. So my first question is, how is this lack of spectrum equipment affecting tribal residents living in those areas?
Well, great. I want to clarify one thing. So the FCC granted those companies the licenses, and the minimum broadcast requirement for the licenses make it so, and they operate at the minimum level so that the device doesn't work. So you cannot make a phone call. So it's a very serious health and emergency issue for folks who don't have a landline phone in the home that have an emergency arise, or for a lot of our children, this last year was a lost school year because there was no broadband connectivity and there was no service. So requiring people that have the spectrum to put up the equipment so it's usable is the thought I was trying to get across to everybody. And if they're not willing to do that, then they should have to relinquish that spectrum so that others could utilize that spectrum to benefit the community members. That was the point I was trying to make. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Mr. Haas, have these issues influenced discussions of spectrum sovereignty at the Navajo Nation? How is this holding back sovereignty in the Navajo Nation?
Well, it's holding back the whole education system and the healthcare system. And that basically is the root of pretty much all of our lives, to be honest with you. There is one good news piece, is that the federal government did allow the Navajo Nation to get the 2.5 spectrum that wasn't allocated in the area. But that spectrum is really going to be focusing on broadband to the home. It's like a 5G spectrum. But that is where the government has become self-sufficient and taken that spectrum. And now we need the dollars to buy the equipment to deploy the spectrum and to get it into people's homes so that they can utilize it. So that's a perfect example where the community came together and got spectrum of value. And now it's a matter of, we need the dollars to deploy your proper equipment in the end users' homes.
And Mr. Haas, I want to paint a picture for the folks back in Central Florida that I represent. For Navajo Nation, how big of a tribal nation is this? Is it rural, or are there a lot of dense areas, or and how does that affect the spectrum issues?
So it's a very rural community. There's 27,000 square miles. So it's the size of the state of West Virginia. It only has 185,000 residents that live on it. So our largest communities are only 5,000 or 6,000 folks. And we have a lot of mountains, and we actually have some forest areas. So that kind of paints the picture of the actual terrain and the difficulty of getting the equipment out in those areas where the actual people live. The other thing is the Navajo people historically and traditionally are agricultural based, but they also live very, very far apart from each other. So a family would live on 165 acres of land because the land is very barren, and they needed that historically to support themselves. So that kind of gives
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Haas. We know both in tribal nations in Florida and across the nation and rural America in general, this is going to be a game changer for agricultural communities in our district and across the nation. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Soto. So